From WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network, the O'Rourke-Cruz debate at Southern Methodist University. This is the first in a series of debates. There are three debates. The O'Rourke people had asked for as many as 5 or 6, and one to be in Espanol. Evidently, Cruz claims that he can understand Espanol, but his speaking of it is subpar. Thus, they would have the three debates. The next debate will be in Houston, Texas, and the final debate will be in San Antonio. These are both towns with large Latino populations, and it's very interesting to look at some of the polling, particularly amongst Latinos, as to where the numbers stand. In Texas, as opposed to other areas, Latinos tend to be more conservative, as is Texas, a red state that has been made a red state. There was a situation that occurred when Lyndon Johnson was in the House, and Lyndon to the Senate, I should say, and Lyndon, when he was in the leadership and he was selected to be the vice president, his replacement was a conservative Democrat. And this is one of the schisms that the late President John F. Kennedy went to address in Texas, the fight between the conservative forces in Texas that represented the business interests and the progressives. Ralph Yarborough comes to mind. There was a progressive at one time in Texas. Now, Lyndon Johnson in Texas was a Democrat, and what it meant to be a Democrat. He was not a Dixiecrat, but he was a Democrat. But he could work with people like Russell in Georgia, who was a racist, and of course Sam Rabin was from Texas, the House Speaker. But they could get the legislation done. And that was a difference in that era with Texas Democrats, although they were conservative, and Texas was a petroleum state, period. So they represented the petroleum industry and the viewpoint of the petroleum industry. They had a nut that used to drive around there that was in the oil business, as they call it, named Hunt. Old Hunt had a syndicated column where he could strew out various right-wing platitudes at the time in newspaper and on radio. And then there was another character that was around in the 80s named Eddie Childs. I don't know if Eddie Childs is still alive or not. Perhaps he's probably dead. But he would be on usually another oil company type after doing the Monday night football, and he had his little mock. I can't remember it word for word right now, but I'll have to look it up for the make a note of it for the Monday morning quarterback or subsequent broadcast. Eddie Childs. Anyway, this is basically what happened as Texas became more and more conservative, and this is why the Democrats have been shut out in Texas since 1990s. So it's been a long, long time. They've had various senators from Texas, and the latest one addition is this character Cruz. But now Cruz himself is an interesting character, ambitious character, disliked by most of the Senate, his fellow senators, whether they be Republicans or Democrats. Was in the 2016 15 primaries running for president. And of course in that primary he was one of the last remaining characters. He was known as Ted Lying Cruz, Lying Ted Cruz, get him right here. And DJ Trump basically plummeted him, cannibalized him, made him into a joke, quite literally. and now he has to rely on the popularity of DJ Trump in Texas to get him across the line. So in other words, DJ Trump has demasculized him quite literally. It said his father was involved in the assassination of JFK, which is quite possible because his father was in the CIA. Now his father is a right-wing minister, and it's interesting how the right-wingers have moved from and encapsulated themselves in the evangelical movement. Trump was speaking to some evangelicals, and the Vice President Pence was at the so-called Value Conference. The Value Conference had sort of disappeared. They used to be their main standard was same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage has become less of an issue. It was not even in the 2016 campaign. Thus, their values are streaming down. They still have abortion rights, as they call it. There's a big one with the evangelicals, and now they moved into such things as gender inequality. They're taking on trans and various other people from the GBL communities, in various communities of that type. And also a big issue with them is so-called immigration, which is a disguised racist issue. It's fitted for them. And this is where the strange a situation there in Texas with Latinos. But one thing you have to remember, particularly in Texas, there are Latinos in Texas that are opposed to other Latinos coming into the country. Now, this varies from where the Latinos are in those communities. It's a different community up in El Paso, and which is borders Mexico. You can walk across the bridge. Used to live across the bridge in Juarez. Anyway, nonetheless, that's from where Beto O'Rourke hails from, and he is fluent in Espanol. A different type of senator than what you've seen, a representative, I should say, what you've seen in the past. The debate, we watched it, and you'll hear when we leave an edited version of it. There were some technical problems, I think, in the last few minutes, and that's why we say an edited version. But it is as close as you'll come to the full debate, and we'll run over it here. We're working from the Stateman, that's in Austin, Texas, and the Dallas Morning News. And we'll later go to El Paso, not in this broadcast, but we have those up here. And we'll give you some of the latest polling numbers to set up how close this contest is. The Cook report has moved it from lean Republican to a toss-up contest. That just basically means that anyone can win the contest. Now, we've had several polls, and I've looked at the polls here. Let's see. The first poll here is the Reuters poll. Now, that is the collaboration. We talked about that on Friday Jobber with the University of Virginia. Had Representative O'Rourke, Congressman O'Rourke, ahead by 2 points, less than the margin of error. These are likely voters. And you'll see all the surveys now will be of likely voters and not registered voters. The key to possible O'Rourke victory is his turnout. New voters. He's got to get them. No doubt about that. And get them to the poll. Now, Quinnipiac poll had O'Rourke ahead by, had Cruz ahead by 9 points. We went through that poll. It was a very interesting poll. Now, public policy, they are out of North Carolina. Has Cruz ahead by 48 to 45. And it was commissioned by a healthcare advocacy group. Now, public policy used to play a more important role. Jennings, I believe, is the person that runs that out of North Carolina, in the political situation. Don't hear as much from them now as we used to. In fact, this is the first time, I think, in the cycle that I've heard from public policy. I'll have to check that out, and we'll bring that in a subsequent broadcast. But it's kind of interesting that they're known as a lean Democrat House, such as Rasmussen is a lean Republican House. And we'll do the Clear Channel here in a minute, but let's just hit a couple of the high points here. From, I believe, the Dallas Morning News is what we have here. The opening sentence here is the Senator Cruz and the Representative O'Rourke engaged in a fierce clash Friday night, exposing deep rips and a clear choice for Texas voters over immigration, police brutality, gun violence, and the best way to deal with DJ Trump. Cruz naturally, and this is kind of a departure from what happened in the presidential primaries, exception Hillary Clinton labeled Bernie Sanders as socialist, didn't really take on. Now, in this particular debate, Cruz immediately depicts O'Rourke as a socialist, and O'Rourke at the same time countered that by saying that Cruz is derelict in his duty to stand up to an out-of-control president. His focus seems to be on fighting for illegal aliens and forgetting the millions of Americans. You know, Americans are dreamers too. This is what Cruz said. This is around the dreamers legislation that President Barack Obama signed. And those are young people that were brought here as little children, and they've grown up in the U.S., went to school, college, university, etc., trade schools, and have a lot to give to the American nation as a whole. And Congressman O'Rourke, of course, brought up the dollar value of the dreamers if they leave the country. They are a smaller group, so it's a little bit different than dealing with the dreamers and dealing with the overall so-called immigration issue. Towards the end, when the moderators asked each to say something nice about the other, Congressman O'Rourke praised Cruz for his dedication to public service and for his family's sacrifice that entailed. But then quickly pivoted to a attack on O'Rourke, echoed that, painting him as a socialist akin to Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is, in the American context, or in the context, a social democrat, and that is basically all that you can say of Bernie Sanders and where Bernie Sanders is. O'Rourke, of course, is a free terms, and let me get that right. A Democrat, and of course he blistered past the first term Tea Party senator. Now, that's one of the very interesting situations here, that O'Rourke has 200,000 donors. That's according to Public, putting O'Rourke over the $30 million mark. And this is from the Dallas Morning News. Now, the next debates here will be on the 30th at the University of Houston, for me, if I'd been there before. And on October 16th, will be close to the election. That'll be in San Antonio, Texas. O'Rourke, of course, is running his first statewide race. He's been to all 240, 250 counties in Texas. So he's done his homework. Town hall meetings. He was at Texas Prairie View A&M University there. And what we would advise the O'Rourke people to do is study the debates between DJ Trump and Ted Lying Cruz, or Lying Ted Cruz, or what do you want to call him there. Period. Cruz, he was the Attorney General of Texas, argued that, 9 cases before the Supreme Court, excelled at Harvard Law School, and was a champion debater at Princeton. Now, his skill as a debater did not come out in last night's debate. Basically, what Cruz was attempting to do was to excite his base. You'd think at one time in the debate he was running against Hillary Clinton. I didn't hear Nancy Pelosi mentioned, but of course I was also listening to a Fox game when we were doing the recording, so perhaps we missed it. I hadn't read it, bothered to go back and read the transcript. But one of the issues here, the NFL protests, that's the kneels that were championed by Colin Kaepernick, who now has a multi-million-dollar contract with the sports shoe seller Nike. Well, the whole situation there is, and Jesse Jackson tweeted that Colin is in a negotiation with some NFL team. We don't know if that'll pan out or not. He has not been working. He's been placed on the proverbial blacklist. But this is one of the issues that DJ Trump, champion, calling the players scumbags or SOBs, whatever he called them. And Beto did a very good job of distinguishing what patriotism is without using the word patriotism, and a history of the civil rights movement, etc. But these players are demonstrating against inequities within the society, period. They're not disrespecting anyone, and this is where people get confused. The so-called national anthem is just a national anthem, period. Has nothing to do with the conduct of the nation's business, nor has the flag. The flag is constantly disrespected. If you look at books, the Imam, or the minister, I should say, Louis Farrakhan out of Chicago, was reading that, and of course he's 85, 86 years old. He knows what the flag was, and the flag, how the flag is to be carried. Every Boy Scout would have understood that, or Cub Scout, or whatever. And when it's displayed in football stadiums, it's never supposed to be displayed vertically. So in other words, that is in itself disrespecting the flag. The flag is worn as headscarves, it's worn as shirts, it's worn as pants, etc. But in the classic tradition of flag, quote unquote, etiquette, all those things are disrespectful to the flag. Much more so than kneeling during the protests. And protests in the country during the civil rights movement, protesters carried American flags, and racist cops would grab the flags out of their hands, while at the same time Confederate flags were flying all around them. And that's a big schism between these right-wingers in Texas and elsewhere. Texas is more of a Lone Star flag than, than the Confederate flag, but many of these people in Charlottesville, of course we remember Heber Hire, the same situation was. You had the Confederate flag of these white supremacists and various other reactionary groups flying much more prominent than the American flag. But many of these people just substituted. In other words, the American flag becomes a Confederate flag, period, and running a national program. Now, they did talk about health care, and the situation there is that is hammering Republicans into the ground. Uncle Carl Rove talked about it. But the only thing the Republicans can say is, in their zeal to appeal Obamacare, as they call it, that was brought up in the debate, Obamacare being a much more comprehensive health care program and a national program. Now, prior to Obamacare, there had been various other attempts, the Hillary Clinton attempt, which fell through. But what you had before Obamacare was 50 different state programs. In the Commonwealth, there's Romneycare, which is a state program that Obamacare was patterned after. What progressives are calling for now is single payer or Medicare for all. Would cover everyone, period. But what Cruz was talking about was the Republicans' reaction there and pre-existing conditions. If you have a cancer, or if you have hypertension and diabetes. I have diabetes, so I can be there. He had prostate cancer, all those kinds of things. Well, you can't get insurance because you have a pre-existing condition, even hypertension. Thus, it would be up to under the Republican scheme. Cruz was trying to say, well, we'll keep pre-existing conditions. But the problem there is that the Republicans would leave that up to each state, which would mean in these states, insurance commissioners, etc., the insurance companies would come in, and many of the backward states would not allow pre-existing conditions, and people would have to pay much more. That is always the issue. And then, of course, is the cost of medical care. If you look at the cost, yes, premiums have went up, but the Obama Affordable Care Act did not set the rates directly. The insurance companies themselves did that, and Cruz did not bring that up. And that is one of the things that Beto O'Rourke should hammer in his town meetings. He's held many, many, many town meetings. So these are some of the quick talking points. Skinny health care, that's one the Republicans had out there, where you have very high deductibles, $2,500, $5,000 deductibles. Co-pays are very high, and your premiums are less. Under the Affordable Care Act, you could only buy that kind of coverage as a very temporary stopgap type coverage, period. So there's some of the things that they came up there with, and they even got into the Amber Geyer situation. Incidentally, there have been more subpoenas issued in that case. She's a Dallas police officer that murdered Barkham Jung in his own apartment. And Congressman O'Rourke called for a full investigation there, and that she should be terminated. Period. Well, there is more evidence coming up. They're trying to get these surveillance cameras. They even have a surveillance camera that surveyed the locks on the various apartments. So we'll see more evidence coming out there. But this whole idea of disproportionate police brutality against African Americans is well documented. There's no doubt about that. And what Cruz was trying to do, as with Trump, is align himself with the law enforcement community. Now that plays well in some dominant communities, that play well to some of his base. But the whole situation there is, where is his base? And that's where it's going to be very, very interesting in this election. Will Cruz be able to get out his quote-unquote base, which his base is in rural Texas primarily, and some of the extraburbs and some of the suburbs around Houston, Dallas-Fort Worth area. But the problem is here, and he's got the Kavanaugh hearings. I don't remember if that came up or not, but that situation is deteriorating by the day. Now there is a person that was forced to resign from the staff of old man Grassley because of a history of sexual harassment. He even resigned. He was on temporary from a public relations firm that handled other things, the Federalist Society. He had been on leave. Now he's no longer there. He was working for some character in North Carolina named Bell. He left that position also. So this person is the article in the Washington Post. So we see those kinds of things coming up there. This football thing is a side issue that many people have not come to grips with and understanding it, but at the same time the NFL ratings are falling anyway. And they were falling before the so-called flag protests came about. Now those protests are not as vigorous now. And it's one of the things that you have the protests, they have impact on people. And of course any movement, as go, and this is a social movement, changed its tactics and strategies. So now we have Colin Kaepernick on TV, bulletin boards, etc. He's a symbol. You'll see less of people standing up, kneeling, or whatever, because they don't need to. People now understand the issues as far as the NFL is concerned, period. Let me kind of finish this up here. Back to the Amber Geyer case here. He says basically this is Cruz, that Congressman O'Rourke is ready to convict her or already to fire her. It's a troubling pattern. Well, it's not a troubling pattern, period. The situation is the overwhelming evidence out there is obvious that the woman entered the wrong apartment and killed the man. Now, there's witness testimony that heard that supposedly, allegedly heard her beating on the door, wanting to get in. Now, some of this third-party industry could bring that up. The news goes on to talk about the Trump factor and Cruz's dignity. Well, getting much into that. The senator's chances could hinge on enthusiasm amongst the Trump backers in Texas. Trump will be in Texas sometime in October after being lobbied by the Lieutenant Governor Patrick. And he did taunt his alliance with the president on judges, taxes, trade policy. The trade policy is killing Texas, period. And NASA. Now, that's very interesting because the Republicans have wanted to privatize NASA for many, many years. Period. Texans, he said, wonder where our junior senator is when Trump defends Russian strongman V.I. Putin and undermines democratic institutions. If the president attacks you personally, your wife, or your father, that's your business, he said. But when Trump attacks fundamental American values, that's everyone's business. This is Beto O'Rourke talking. We need a senator who will stand up to this president where we must and make sure that we are a nation of laws, not of men. That was a very strong situation. So as you see more in that, we'll go to the Stateman in Austin, Texas. The headline here is Cruz and O'Rourke engage in debate at SMU in a toss-up Senate race. So now they're they're using the word cross-up, period, as this test race moves on. Cruz was a sharp-tongued defender of conservative Texas values, presenting O'Rourke as a fashionable attire of the far left, thinking out of place with Texas, fueled by a rash of hard left, energized by DJ Trump. Of course, O'Rourke presented himself as fresh, open, earnest figure, uninterested in partisan bickering, in contrast to what he portrayed his rivals, truth be damned and slash and burn rhetoric. And that is what it was. For Cruz, the object was to remind Texas voters that he's an articulate and passionate apostle of the kind of conservative values on guns, law and order, immigrants, and patriotism that for a generation has been a vital guarantee of success in statewide elections in Texas. The only difference is that Cruz is actually born in Canada. He's not even born in the U.S. He's a different kind of politician. There's no doubt about that. It was a kind of performance that made him the front runner for the Republican presidential nomination in his first term in the Senate. The debate was intended to shore up his base in a year in which polls indicate that some of those who regularly vote Republican might consider staying or turning what should be a Republican rump into a real race, and that is no doubt about it. Incidentally, that number of counties is 224, so a hell of a lot of counties. In Texas, that's O'Rourke went on his listening tour. That is the way to do it, and he understands Texas values. And he cited several instances of people that he talked to in various parts of the state. In the heat of the debate, he sought to challenge what he considers Cruz's misstatements about his record, pulling his statements into a critique of Cruz as too much of the politician to Cruz talent for cutting critiques into character flaws of a relentless politician. Cruz has a tendency to mischaracterize positions. O'Rourke had, and that's the Lion Ted thing, told a throng of reporters on the debate stage after the hour-long event. Cruz did not offer post-debate comments. That's very interesting there. For a champion debater, usually you would. If you talk about NFL players kneeling during the national anthem at football games to call attention to injustice in this country, he's talking about flag burning, and this is basically what Lion Ted is known for. There, he talks about legalizing heroin and fentanyl, but everyone could see his answers and do the research for themselves and come to their own conclusions. So this is some of the things that he talks about that would have been on the use of a canvas. Contrasting styles were nowhere more evident than in the answers to the last question. That's a standard saltwater question, which Julie Fine of NBC5, who moderated debate along with Dallas Morning News political writer Grover Jeffers, asked the candidates in order to end the tenuous debate on a positive note to say something about the other. Well, that's, I mean, much that we already explored that one, period. While most of the candidates' statements were familiar, those following the campaign and debate may reach a broader audience, in which that's the reason for this broadcast. There didn't appear to be any knockout punches or major gaps. It is unlikely by itself to make a markedly change in the contour of the race. And let me get to the end of this. The DWI 20 years ago by Representative O'Rourke. It was something out of the Houston papers said he tried to leave the scene. Well, the man was drunk, who knows. To Friday's debate, O'Rourke had previously not addressed the accuracy of the witness claim. He kept O'Rourke from leaving the scene. Though the witness was not identified by name, O'Rourke was not charged with leaving the scene of the accident. This is very important there. I did not try to leave the scene of the accident. Though driving drunk, which I did, it was a terrible mistake, and there's no excuse or justification or defense. So he ended it there, and this was the Houston Chronicle, and the police report included a statement from a witness, but he was not charged with leaving the scene of an accident. This is one of the little dirty politics things that Lion Ted Cruz pulled out there. So overall, in the so-called debate, it was not a debate in itself, not a classic debate, as Cruz no doubt understands from debating at at Princeton. What it was basically character assassination, but Cruz primarily dealt in the same thing you get out of negative campaign ads: rally around the flag, boys and girls rally around the flag. Conservative justices, which he calls them, constitutional judges, which people like Brent Kavanaugh are not, period. Those are Brent Kavanaugh is a business interest judge, business-centric judge, period. And throwing in a little bit of right-wing social policy, such as Roe v. Wade, etc. But primarily Kavanaugh's job will be to take care of the business interests against the interests of working people, period. That is the history of his decisions, ruling against trade unions, ruling against the rights of women and of people of color. Now, those are the things that they will get from this Kavanaugh. Will things change? Is he as conservative as Anton Scalia? Yes. He's more dangerous than Anton Scalia because Anton Scalia is obviously dead, but at the same time, he's a relatively young person in his early 50s, for the Supreme Court, that is, and could be around for 20 or 30 years. But that does not mean that the court will be the same. Obviously, some of the progressive members of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg comes to mind are moving up there in years. But at the same time, will Roberts become a more moderate voice? Well, we don't know from where he is now. These things tend to change over time. And, of course, there will be other justices coming along. But what it has done is, and the story is still moving here, and if need be, will come with a special report. We'll go on to the debate at Southern Methodist University. Was on Friday night, and that's always a problem too. Friday nights, people are going out to eat. There were ball games going on, and of course in Texas, football, high school football, very, very big in the state of Texas. So the attendance at the debate, we'll try to get some attendance numbers here and put it on the Monday morning quarterback, one other thing on the to-do list. But nonetheless, good day from WBRN Radio and the Boston Red Network. We'll return on the Monday morning quarterback. That'll be on Monday morning as we're in the last days, literally, or last week of the of Major League Baseball, period. And we'll be reporting on that, and as we get ready for the playoffs to come up the next few weeks in Major League Baseball, we're covering college football and the games today in college football. We're not covering the NFL this year on it, but we will have something on our new show all about sports on the baseball playoffs, period. Now, we have one other show in the can here, Clarence Thomas 2.0. We'll have to get that out before Monday just because of the way the hearings are going. But that contrasts the Clarence Thomas hearings in the early 90s with this hearing, throwing in what social media means and how it is conducted. Totally different situation there. Have a good weekend.
Together, we will keep Texas bright, bright red.
Tonight, Senator Ted Cruz and Congressman Beto O'Rourke face off in their first high-stakes debate.
And in the past year and a half, we've been delivering real results.
There are places that have been written off. There are people who have been taken for granted.
From NBC5, the Dallas Morning News, and SMU. Live from the SMU campus in Dallas.
Welcome to the first Texas Senate debate. I'm Julie Fine from NBC5, along with Gromer Jeffers from the Dallas Morning News.
Here are the rules for tonight's 60-minute debate. Once a question is asked, the candidate will have 90 seconds to answer. His opponent will have 60 seconds for a response, and then the candidate will have another 30 seconds for rebuttal.
We've asked the audience not to applaud or react during the debate.
That is, except for now, as we welcome the candidates.
And with that, gentlemen, let's begin. Congressman O'Rourke, you drew the first question, so we're going to start with you because you drew the first question. You said last week, Representative, that you want citizenship for dreamers today, and yet others who have applied to come to America continue to wait. Senator Cruz has said he doesn't support a path to citizenship for dreamers, which means they could be sent back to a country they've never known. Who's right, Representative?
First of all, let me say thank you to NBC5, to the Dallas Morning News, to SMU, and the people of Dallas for having us here at this debate tonight. Let me thank Senator Ted Cruz for participating in this. I'm looking forward to the discussion. My wife, Amy, and I were in Booker, Texas. We've traveled to each one of the 254 counties, one of the reddest communities in the state, and we were surprised as we were going door to door to hear that the number one concern from people in that community was the fate of dreamers. There are nearly 200,000 in the state of Texas, and the salutatorian from Booker High School had just been deported back to his country of origin. And everyone there was concerned about his welfare, but they're also concerned about the fact that he'd just been sent back to a country whose language he didn't speak, where he no longer had family connections, where if he was successful against those long odds, he'd be successful there for that place and not here for Texas. There is no better people than those of us here in this state, Republicans and Democrats, independents alike. The defining border experience, the defining immigrant experience in state, to rewrite our immigration laws in our own image, and to ensure that we begin by freeing dreamers from the fear of deportation, by making them U.S. citizens so they can contribute to their full potential, to the success not just of themselves and their families, but to this country. The economists who've studied it have said that we will lose hundreds of billions of dollars to the negative if we deport them. We will gain hundreds of billions to the positive if we keep them here. Senator Cruz has promised to deport each and every single dreamer. That cannot be the way that Texas leads on this important issue.
Senator Cruz.
Well, good evening and welcome. You know, this issue presents a stark divide between Congressman O'Rourke and me. My views on immigration are simple, and I've summed them up many times in just 4 words. Congressman O'Rourke described law enforcement, described police officers as modern-day Jim Crow. Let me say something. I have gotten to know police officers all across this state. That is offensive. Just today, Fort Worth is burying Officer Garrett Hall with his wife Sabrina and 2 kids who was shot in the head risking his life. Here today, Officer Brian Graham, an Arlington SWAT officer who was shot in the head.
Senator, I'm going to have to stop.
He is here, and every day police officers risk their lives for us. Officer Graham is standing there, his 2 kids. He took a bullet in the head protecting us. And let me say right now, I think it is offensive to call police officers modern-day Jim Crow. That is not Texas.
That's your time, Senator. Please, audience, please. No applause.
What Senator Cruz said is simply untrue. I did not call police officers modern-day Jim Crow. And I, as well as Senator Cruz and everyone here, mourn the passing of Officer Hall in Fort Worth. My uncle Raymond was a sheriff's deputy in El Paso. In fact, he was the captain of the El Paso County Jail. He's the one who taught me to shoot and the responsibility and accountability that comes with owning a gun. But he also taught me what it means to serve everyone, to be sworn to protect and serve everyone in a community, not just some people. With the tragic shooting death of Botham Jean, you have another unarmed black man killed in this country by law enforcement. Now, no member of law enforcement wants that to happen. No member of this community wants that to happen. But we've got to do something better than what we've been doing so far. If African Americans represent 13% of the population in this country, that they represent 1/3 of those who are shot by law enforcement, we have something wrong. If we have the largest prison population on the face of the planet and it is disproportionately comprised of people of color, we have something wrong in this country. Republicans and Democrats should be able to work together with law enforcement and members of the community for real, lasting, meaningful criminal justice reform.
Congressman, that's your time. A quick follow-up to you, Senator Cruz. Do you agree that police violence against unarmed African Americans is a problem? And if so, how would you fix it?
I believe everyone's rights should be protected, regardless of your race, regardless of your ethnicity. But I'll tell you something. I've been to too many police funerals. I was here in Dallas when 5 police officers were gunned down because of irresponsible and hateful rhetoric. I was at the funeral in Houston at Second Baptist Church where Deputy Goforth had been shot in the back of the head at a service station because of irresponsible and hateful rhetoric. Just now, Congressman O'Rourke repeated things he knows aren't true. He stated, for example, white police officers are shooting unarmed African-American children. The Washington Post fact-checked that claim and conclude Congressman O'Rourke was wrong. But I'll tell you something, that rhetoric does damage. That rhetoric divides us on race. It inflames hatred. We should be bringing people together instead of suggesting the police are risking their lives to protect all of us, to protect African Americans, to protect Hispanics, and turning people against the police, I think is profoundly irresponsible.
This is why people don't like Washington, D.C. You just said something that I did not say.
What did you not say?
Attributed it to me.
What did you not say?
I'm not going to repeat the slander and the mischaracterization. I'm not going to repeat the slander.
You're not going to say what you did say?
No, this is your trick in the trade. to confuse and to incite based on fear and not to speak the truth. This is a very serious issue and it warrants the truth and the facts.
All right, Representative O'Rourke, this question is for you. It's about the national anthem protest. Polls show that most Americans don't think that NFL players should be kneeling during the national anthem, even if they believe that they have the right to do so. But you have said there's nothing more American than protesting for your rights. What do you say to people who claim that you're out of step with most Texans on this issue?
I mentioned just a minute ago, members of law enforcement are not sworn to serve and to protect only some people. They're sworn to protect and serve everyone in a given community. Those service members who put their lives on the line, who are serving tonight in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, they swear not to a man or to a group of people in this country, but they swore to support and to defend the Constitution of the United States of America, the Constitution for all of us. The civil rights marchers who took their lives into their hands crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, some beaten to within an inch of their lives, those who lost their lives in the Deep South to the racism of America at the time. Those freedom riders who had the audacity to take Greyhound buses in the Deep South, using the bathrooms or the water fountains of their choice, knowing full well that it would end up in the Mississippi State Penitentiary, Parchman, as it did for John Lewis. They marched not just for themselves, but for everyone. And when now we have injustice in this country, 2 sets of criminal justice systems, depending on your race, your ethnicity, and your color. That prison population that I talked about that is disproportionately comprised of people of color. Too many unarmed African-American men losing their lives in this country. To peacefully protest that injustice, nonviolently, and to call attention to that, to prick the conscience of this country so that those in positions of public trust and power will finally do something. Standing up not just for your rights, but everyone's rights in this country. There's nothing more American than that.
That's your time, Congressman. I'm going to have to ask again for the audience to please refrain from reacting and applause, okay? We need to get through a lot of questions here. Senator Cruz.
You know, Congressman O'Rourke gave a long soliloquy on the civil rights movement. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons that I'm a Republican is because civil rights legislation was passed with the overwhelming support of Republicans. And indeed, the Dixiecrats who were imposing Jim Crow, the Dixiecrats who were beating those protesters were Democrats. And that's one of the reasons I'm proud to be a member of the Party of Lincoln, a member that stands for equal rights for everyone, regardless of what race, what ethnicity. Every human being is a creation of God that our Constitution protects. But nowhere in his answer did he address the fact that when you have people during the national anthem taking a knee, refusing to stand for the national anthem, that you're disrespecting the millions of veterans, the millions of soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines that risk and fight and die to protect that flag and to protect our liberty. And to be clear, everyone has a right to protest. You have a right to speak. But you could speak in a way that doesn't disrespect the flag, that doesn't disrespect the national anthem. And I'll tell you, those civil rights protesters would be astonished if the protests were manifesting and burning the flag. Dr. King, that's not something Dr. King stood for. He stood
Senator
for justice
Cruz.
Without disrespecting the men and women who fight for this country.
Senator,
You heard Senator Cruz's answer. First of all, he again tried to mislead you by taking a peaceful protest during the national anthem to burning a flag. No one here, myself included, has suggested that anyone should be doing that. He also grounded his answer in partisanship, talking about the GOP being better than the Democrats. Listen, I could care less about either party at this moment. At this deeply divided, highly polarized time in our history, this moment calls for all of us, regardless of party or any other difference of race or sexual orientation, how many generations you've been here, or whether you just got here yesterday. We need to come together for this country that we love so much.
And we're moving on here. The next question for Senator Cruz. Details are still being worked out, but Dr. Christine Blasey Ford may testify about her allegations of attempted sexual assault against Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Is there anything you could hear from her that could make you change your vote?
Well, absolutely. And listen, I very much hope Dr. Ford comes next week and testifies before the Judiciary Committee. I publicly called for her to be given an opportunity to testify. I urged my colleagues. The allegations she's raised are serious, and they deserve to be treated with respect. And I hope that she comes and has a full opportunity to tell her story in a way that is respectful, but I also think Judge Kavanaugh deserves a full opportunity to defend himself and to let the American people listen and come to an assessment of what happened. We don't know right now, but we need to give them a full hearing. I will say, though, more broadly than this issue, whether it is Judge Kavanaugh, whether it is Neil Gorsuch, whether it is other Supreme Court nominees, reflects one of the many massive divides on policy and substance and record between me and Congressman O'Rourke. Congressman O'Rourke doesn't want Judge Kavanaugh confirmed. He said that before these allegations. He said that after these allegations. He didn't want Neil Gorsuch confirmed. Congressman O'Rourke agrees with Hillary Clinton. He wants liberal judicial activists on the court who will impose their particular policy view. I have devoted virtually my entire life to defending the Constitution and Bill of Rights. I think one of the major issues the American people had before us in 2016 was, what vision of the court do you want? And I believe Texans want constitutionalists on the Supreme Court who will defend the First Amendment, who will defend free speech, who will defend religious liberty. Religious liberty, one of the fundamental liberties that's been under assault. Who will defend the Second Amendment. And I would note, the justices that Congressman O'Rourke would insist upon, like Hillary Clinton, are justices that would undermine and effectively write the Second Amendment out of the Constitution. Those are radical views, and they're not views consistent with the overwhelming majority of Texans.
Thank you, Senator. That's your time. Representative?
The senator has a troubling history of the kinds of nominees that he's supported. Someone like Jeff Mateer to the federal bench, someone who believes in conversion therapy, who's described transgender children as part of Satan's plan. People like Andrew Oldham, who could not say whether the landmark school integration 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education was correctly decided. People like Brent Talley, who has never tried a case before. Dr. Ford's allegations should be investigated by the FBI, full stop. There's precedent for that. That's the right thing to do given the gravity of the accusations. But the senator is right in this regard. Judge Kavanaugh does not meet the bar for Texas to serve on the Supreme Court in a state that is now 50th in voter turnout. Judge Kavanaugh has a troubling history on voter rights protections. In a state that is the epicenter for the maternal mortality crisis, 3 times as deadly for African American women, Judge Kavanaugh has a troubling history in agreeing that Roe versus Wade is the decided law of the land. And in a state where you can be fired for being gay, his support for civil rights is in question. We need a Supreme Court justice who will decide in favor of people and for their rights that have been established by precedents and under the Constitution. And in Brett Kavanaugh, we do not have that justice.
Representative, that's your time. Senator Cruz.
You know, it was striking. He didn't dispute that he supports liberal activists who would impose the policy he wants. It's not a judge's job to impose policy. And he also didn't dispute that he wants justices that would undermine the Second Amendment. Let me talk for a moment about the case Heller versus District of Columbia. It's a landmark case that upheld the individual right to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment. I represented Texas and 30 other states winning a landmark 5-4 victory, upholding your right to keep and bear arms. Congressman O'Rourke, like Hillary Clinton, wants justices who would overturn that. And let me tell you the position of the dissenters. The dissenters in Heller said that no individual, no American whatsoever has any right to keep and bear arms whatsoever. That's a radical position. It's an extreme position. And that's what Congressman O'Rourke wants to see the Supreme Court doing, writing the Second Amendment out of the Bill of Rights.
That's not true.
And we are moving
How
on
so?
here.
Hold on. He disputed that. You can have a
Of
rebuttal.
course I support the Second Amendment.
In what way, in what respect, and name one judge you've ever supported who would actually
You may
uphold
not
Hillary.
understand how the
Moving on
House
here.
and the Senate work, but it's your job in the Senate to decide if you're going to support or not support a given
Did
nominee.
you endorse Hillary Clinton?
Not in the
Did
House.
you endorse Hillary Clinton?
That has nothing to do
Well,
with
Well, it
my
does,
support
because
of the
Hillary
Second
promised
Amendment.
every
Absolutely
justice
not.
she would appoint would
Absolutely
vote
not.
to
I
overturn Hillary.
fully
You're both
support the
past
Second
your
Amendment.
time, gentlemen. Let's move on here. This question goes to Representative O'Rourke. Representative, you believe in universal background checks and an assault weapons ban in a very gun-friendly state. A poll from Quinnipiac University shows that about half of Texans do support stronger gun laws, while 45% do oppose them. Is Texas ready for a senator who wants to roll back gun rights?
I think Texas is ready for a senator who will defend the Second Amendment, but also ensure that we can protect the lives within our lives. Both Senator Cruz and I were able to visit with students who survived the shooting at Santa Fe High School, to meet with some of those parents there. And students like Bree, who argued that we should have universal background checks because it makes our communities and our states demonstrably safer. We know that from those states that have adopted them that have seen a near 50% reduction in serious gun violence, fewer gun crimes committed against law enforcement, fewer boyfriends killed by their girlfriends, girlfriends killed by their boyfriends. And it is supported by most people in Texas, gun owners, non-gun owners alike, Republicans and Democrats. And listening to those who've served this country, put their life on the line, like the Vietnam veteran that I met in Wichita Falls, who said shortly after the Parkland shooting massacre there in that school that young man was better armed in that school against defenseless children than he was in the jungles of Vietnam. When I listen to the emergency room doctors who tell me that a handgun wound, if it is treated in time, if it doesn't hit a major artery or your heart, will be able to save your life. But a weapon designed for the express purpose of killing people as effectively, as efficiently, and as great a number as possible. The high-impact, high-velocity round from an AR-15 will blow a hole the size of an orange out your back. You will bleed to death before anyone can get to you, and that's exactly what it was designed to do. Weapons of war belong on the battlefields, not in our schools or our churches, our concerts, or our public life.
Senator.
You know, all of us have been horrified as we've seen these school shootings. Santa Fe High School is about a half hour from my house. I was home that morning at 7:30 in the morning when the shooting happened. I jumped in a truck and headed down there. I spent the entire time at Santa Fe High School, that entire day with students, with teachers, with first responders, with parents. It is horrific, and let me say, as the father of two daughters, there is something deeply wrong that we have these shootings. There are a lot of things behind it that have nothing to do with government. They have things to do with things like removing God from the public square, like losing the moral foundation of much of our society, like losing the binds of community and family. But I'll tell you, that afternoon, Governor Abbott and I were in a hospital visiting with a young man who was shot. There were probably a dozen other students in that room. And we said, what's the answer to this? And we just kept our mouths shut and listened. Every one of those dozen Santa Fe students who had just been in that shooting, they said, almost word for word, they said, gun control's not the answer. They said, you know what, if you take our guns, you're not going to make us any safer. You're just going to mean that the killers and murderers have guns. We asked, well, what do you do then? The number one answer I heard from the students and parents and teachers at Santa Fe is more armed police officers in schools to keep our kids safe. We can make our schools safer
Senator,
by having officers protect them.
Senator, that's your time. Representative.
We had a town hall meeting in Graham, Texas, where I met an educator named Holly. She's been teaching for 29 years, so she understands what goes on in schools and in the classroom. She's also the advisor to the Clay Target team. She's probably the best marksman in that community, maybe of anyone here at this auditorium today. And she said from her experience in the classroom, from her experience as a marksman, bringing a firearm into that classroom is not going to make those children safer. Listening to Rhonda Hart, who lost her daughter Kimberly in the Santa Fe shooting, she tells me bringing weapons into those classrooms would not have saved her daughter's life. It will not make us safer. Thoughts and prayers, Senator Cruz, are just not going to cut it anymore. The people of Texas, the children of Texas deserve action.
Well, hold on a second, and let me be very clear. More armed police officers in our schools is not thoughts and prayers. I'm sorry that you don't like thoughts and prayers. I will pray for anyone in harm's way. but I'll also do something about it. And my very first year in the Senate, I led the way introducing legislation that would have provided $300 million in additional funding for school safety, to harden our schools, to put metal detectors, to have more police officers. And unfortunately, your party in the Senate, the Democratic Party, filibustered that legislation because their only focus politically was trying to undermine the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens.
All right, Senator, let's move on.
Let's move on.
This question is for you, Senator Cruz. The last time you stood for election was in 2016. You were the runner-up in the Republican primary for president. You ran against then New York businessman Donald Trump. Donald Trump, as you remember, dubbed you Lion Ted. He took swipes at your wife and father. You, in turn, called him a pathological liar. And quite frankly, there are so many insults between the two of you, it would take the rest of this show to go through them all. But now that he's president, you guys have become friendly to the point where you praised him in Time magazine. How do you respond to critics who say that as it relates to President Trump, you've lost your dignity?
Well, there is no doubt 2016 was an election unlike any others. And there were some hard shots thrown. I'll tell you, my dad, who's here tonight, anyone who knows me knows my father has been my hero every day of my life. And Heidi and my daughters who are here as well, anyone who knows me knows Heidi is my best friend in the world. I think she is the most beautiful woman on the face of the planet. I am blessed from God to be married to Heidi Cruz. Now, after the election in 2016, I faced a choice. Donald Trump had been elected president, and we had an opportunity to do something extraordinary. I made a conscious choice to do the job I've been elected to do, which is to represent 28 million Texans. I've got a responsibility, which is to fight for every person here and every person in this state. And so I have worked hand in hand with the president on substance, and we have delivered remarkable victories, the biggest tax cut of a generation. We've seen 4 million new jobs created since Trump was elected, and we cut taxes and cut regulations. We're seeing record low unemployment. Texans' lives are better. So yes, I could have chosen to make it about myself, to be selfish and say, you know what, my feelings are hurt, so I'm going to take my marbles and go home. But I think that would have been not doing the job I was elected to, and every single day in the Senate it has been my job to fight for jobs, and to fight for 28 million Texans. I've done that, and if the people of Texas re-elect me, I will continue to fight each and every day for jobs and economic opportunity for Texas.
That's your time. Representative O'Rourke.
Farmers and ranchers that I meet all across this state as I visit each one of the 254 counties of Texas wonder where their junior senator is, as this president enters trade wars and imposes tariffs that are going to hurt no state more than Texas. Average citizens from both parties and independents alike wonder where our junior senator is when you have a president who may or may not have tried to collude with Russia in 2016, but to quote the conservative columnist George Will on that stage in Helsinki as he defended Vladimir Putin instead of the United States of America, that was collusion in action. Listen, if the president attacks you personally, your wife, your father, how you respond is your business. But when the president attacks our institutions, this country, allows a foreign power to invade our democracy, that is our business. We need a U.S. senator who will stand up to this president where we must, work with him where we can, but ensure that 242 years into this audacious experiment, that we are still a nation of laws and not one of men.
So let me say two things. Number one, Congressman O'Rourke invoked farmers and ranchers. I'll tell you, I'm incredibly privileged to have the support of farmers and ranchers across the state. Indeed, the Texas Farm Bureau has endorsed my reelection because I've been fighting for farmers and ranchers for 6 straight years. And on policy, Congressman O'Rourke's position are dramatically out of touch with farmers and ranchers. He supports President Obama's Waters of the United States rule. He's voted in favor of it multiple times, puts massive burdens on farmers and ranchers. He's voted in favor of the death tax, keeping it broad, sucking farmers and ranchers and small businesses into it. That's not good for farmers and ranchers. But you know where his question ended? It ended on an attack on Donald Trump. And the modern Democratic Party is just consumed with hatred for Donald Trump. That's why Congressman O'Rourke is the only Democratic Senate nominee in the country to explicitly commit to voting to impeach President Trump. That is extreme, and that doesn't reflect Texas.
That's your time. Representative O'Rourke, you have addressed your 1998 DWI arrests numerous times during your public career, but not this question. As the Houston Chronicle pointed out recently, a witness said in that accident that you tried to leave the scene of the accident. Did you, and should voters be concerned about this incident?
Yeah. I did not try to leave the scene of the accident, though driving drunk, which I did, is a terrible mistake for which there is no excuse or justification or defense, and I will not try to provide one. I can only tell you that I was able to have a second chance in my life. I was able to start a small business with good friends in El Paso, was able to meet Amy on a blind date before Tinder, raised 3 amazing kids with her, Ulysses, Molly, and Henry, serve my community on the El Paso City Council, and represent 750,000 people from my community in the United States Congress. I've made the most that I could with my second chance and my opportunity. What I do know is that as a white man in this country, there's a privilege that I enjoy that many African American men and women do not. They do not have that second chance. They're forced to check that box on an employment application form that makes it harder for them to get a job. They're ineligible for the Pell Grants that would allow them to attend SMU or TCU or any institution in this area. And their choices are narrowed, their options are constrained in their lives. Everyone deserves a second chance. And if my experience can contribute to an understanding that allows me to work with Republicans and Democrats alike on real and meaningful criminal justice reform, to ensure that everyone is able to live to their full potential and no one's mistake defines them for the rest of their lives, and that will be something good in whatever meaningful way it is that has come out of that terrible decision on my part.
That's your time, Congressman. Senator?
You know, I don't intend to get into Congressman O'Rourke's personal history, but I will keep the focus on issues and substance and record. And I will say, as a member of Congress, he introduced legislation that would make it easier for those with drug convictions to get driver's licenses. I think that's a real mistake, and it's part of a pattern. There's a consistent pattern when it comes to drug use that in almost every single instance, Congressman O'Rourke supports more of it. So when he was on the El Paso City Council, he's one of the leading advocates in the country for legalizing marijuana. He wrote a book about that. Now, legalizing marijuana is actually a question on which I think reasonable minds can differ. I've always had a libertarian bent myself. I think it ought to be up to the states. I think Colorado can decide one way. I think Texas can decide another. But I'll tell you, Congressman O'Rourke didn't stop with marijuana. He introduced and he advocated for a resolution in the El Paso City Council calling for a national debate on legalizing all narcotics. That includes heroin and fentanyl and cocaine. And let me say, that is not, I believe, a reasonable issue on which people can disagree. Now, I suspect Congressman O'Rourke will say, we're just calling for a debate on it. Well, we're on a debate stage now. I will tell you, I think it would be a profound mistake to legalize all narcotics, and it would hurt the children of this country. That would be a serious mistake.
Senator, that's your time.
I agree with you.
Representative, please.
To be clear, I don't want to legalize heroin and cocaine and fentanyl. But what I do want to ensure is that where in this country, most states have decided that marijuana will be legal at some form, for medicinal purposes, for recreational purposes, or at a minimum will be decriminalized, that we don't have another veteran in this state prescribed an opioid because the doctor at the VA would rather prescribe medicinal marijuana but is prohibited by law from doing that. Another older woman with fibromyalgia who's not able to use medicinal cannabis because it's against the law here. And another African American man, because more likely than not, that's who will be arrested for possession of marijuana, to rot behind bars instead of enjoying his freedom and the opportunity to contribute to the greatness of this country. Yes, I want to end the war on drugs and specifically want to end the prohibition on marijuana.
And Grover, let me point out, he didn't dispute that as 9 years ago, as an elected member of the El Paso City Council, he introduced and advocated for energetically debating ending the prohibition on all narcotics, on everything. He says he doesn't agree with that now, but that was only 9 years ago. And I'll tell you, when it comes to this is an issue that's personal to me. My older sister, Miriam, died of a drug overdose. People all across the state of Texas, 70,000 people a year are dying of drug overdoses in this country. We have an opioid crisis. And I think talking about legalizing all narcotics, I think that is profoundly dangerous, and it doesn't represent the interest of Texans.
All right, Senator.
That's your time. And Senator Cruz, you get the next question. You fought for the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, but Texas has the highest rate of uninsured people in the nation, and more than 1 million residents signed up through the federal marketplace this year. How do you propose addressing the health care needs of Texans?
I believe Obamacare has hurt millions of Texans. It was sold to the people of this country on a promise from President Obama: if you like your health insurance plan, you can keep it. If you like your doctor, you can keep it. PolitiFact, the left-leaning organization, rated that 2013's lie of the year as millions of Americans had their health insurance canceled against their will. But the biggest reason people are unhappy with Obamacare is it's made their premiums skyrocket. I hear from Texans all over this state, I can't afford health insurance. President Obama promised the average family's premiums would drop $2,500 a year. In fact, they have risen over $5,000 a year. When Obamacare was implemented, the most inexpensive plan for a 30-year-old healthy man here in the Dallas area was $363 a year. Today, in this zip code where all of us are right now, a bronze plan for a 30-year-old healthy man is about $3,000 a year. A silver plan is over $4,400 a year. That's going from $363 to, in just a few years, increasing over tenfold. That's not right. What do we need to do? We need to lower premiums for everyone. How do we do that? We can protect pre-existing conditions, and you need to understand, everyone agrees we're going to protect pre-existing conditions. But we also need more choices, more competition, more options so that prices drop, so that young people coming out of SMU or coming out of schools across this country can afford health insurance instead of facing the disaster that Obamacare has done to our health care system.
And that's your time, Senator. Representative?
I don't know how you're going to repeal every single word of the Affordable Care Act and keep protections for pre-existing conditions. Keep protections for Victor, who's the son of our new friend Laura Lehman, who we met. Victor has cerebral palsy, has uncontrolled seizures, is incredibly expensive medically to keep alive. He's a medically complex child, but his life is worth just as much as anyone else's life in this country. I want to make sure that we keep those pre-existing condition protections for Victor. I want to make sure that we improve and stabilize the Affordable Care Act. I want to make sure that I never meet another young man like Joey in Laredo, 29 years old, has diabetes, now has glaucoma, does not have health care. And so the one time that he did see a doctor, that doctor said, you will be dead before you are the age of 40. And as he gets closer to death and takes himself to the emergency room, as the suffering becomes too great, the outcomes will not be as good as they would have been otherwise if we had invested up front, and the care will be disproportionately more expensive. I want to make sure that we also expand Medicaid. This state left $100 billion on the table that could have provided care for people in this community, introduce Medicare as an option on the exchanges, and then get to universal, guaranteed, high-quality health care for every child, for every woman, for every man in this state and every state in the union.
Representative, that's your time. Senator Cruz.
You know, it was striking that Congressman O'Rourke didn't have a word to say to the millions of Texans whose premiums have skyrocketed. He talked about pre-existing conditions, but every one of us agrees pre-existing conditions must be protected. And indeed, when we were debating Obamacare, I introduced legislation called the Consumer Freedom Amendment that would protect pre-existing conditions, but that the Health and Human Services Agency ran the numbers and found the Consumer Freedom Amendment, allowing people to purchase the health insurance that you want, would reduce annual premiums about $5,000 a year. We've got to lower premiums, and Congressman O'Rourke has voted 67 times to keep Obamacare. He hasn't been there to fix the people that are getting hurt, that are forced into part-time jobs. Instead, his answer is socialized medicine. Socialized medicine is a mistake, and it would hurt the people of Texas.
Okay, and our next question is about trade. This goes to Representative O'Rourke. Both of you have expressed concern over changes in trade and tariffs and their impact here in Texas. What could you realistically do to rein in President Trump on trade? Why should voters believe that you would be more successful getting him to change course than Senator Cruz, who actually has a working relationship with him?
Understand the impacts of this firsthand in El Paso, the community I represent, where we're raising our children, a trading community. One out of every 4 jobs is connected to U.S.-Mexico trade in our community. I understand it from listening to the people of Texas. Unlike the senator, I've shown up to every single county in the state. Being in Seminole, listening to a pecan grower who's seen the tariffs on his pecans go from 7% to 47%. No one's buying his pecans around the world right now. And though he said these trade wars might end, these tariffs might come down, those purchasers in those other countries will find other countries from whom to buy. His farm will no longer be sustainable anymore. When has this country ever gone to war without allies? That's precisely what we're doing by levying $200 billion in tariffs against China and alienating the EU and Canada and our traditional trading partners. This state, with its farming and ranching and producing and manufacturing and export-based economy, needs a senator who will work with the president where we can and stand up to him where we must. I met with the President's Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross. I met with his United States Trade Representative, Representative Lighthizer. And this is the case that I made to them. Not only does this state depend on trade, and we must protect those trading relationships that we have, but if we are to improve NAFTA and our relationship with Mexico specifically, let's ensure that those Mexican workers also have the ability to organize, to demand higher wages, which will make the United States worker a little bit more competitive. In the draft that I've seen so far of this latest agreement, that is included within it. So it shows that I'm able to stand up to the president where it counts and able to work with him where it will do the most good.
That's your time, Senator Cruz.
Free trade is good for Texas. It's good for Texas farmers and ranchers. It's good for Texas businesses. I have made the case to President Trump directly and personally dozens of times that we should be expanding our access to foreign markets, opening up the Mexican energy markets, expanding our access to Canada. If you look at the EU, it was interesting that Congressman O'Rourke referenced the EU. We've actually seen real breakthroughs in trade with the EU, that the European Union is now talking about sitting down with America and looking at zero tariffs, lowering their tariffs. You know, I thought it was interesting Congressman O'Rourke brought up pecan farmers, because I've made the case directly to the administration that they should work on India to lower their tariffs on pecans so that we can export to India. But the difference is, I've made that case repeatedly to the president. Over and over again, I've worked hand in hand with the president on policy wins for the people of Texas. As far as I know, Congressman O'Rourke has never spoken to the president, other than to publicly call for his impeachment. That doesn't suggest a relationship in the state of Texas when you are leading the extreme left wing wanting to impeach the president and attack the president. That's not setting you up to have victories for the people of Texas.
Representative?
I'll work with anyone, anytime, anywhere, and that includes the President of the United States. Worked with Republican colleagues to expand access to mental health care. There were 500,000 veterans who put their lives on the line for this country, who by law, because of the status of their discharge, were unable to go into a VA and see the psychiatrist or psychologist who would save their lives. I was able to bury the differences between myself and a Republican colleague who had a similar proposal. We introduced it, got it passed in the House. There was a similar bill passed in the Senate, signed into law by President Trump. That's saving lives of veterans in this state and throughout this country right now. So whether it's veterans, service members, farmers, ranchers, Americans, I'll stand up for everyone and work with anyone, including the president, to make sure that we do better for this country.
Senator Cruz, this question is about Texas values. You campaign on the fact that you represent Texas's values, but if you look at the polls,
day for lower taxes, lower rates, and more jobs. That's right. We have a real race in the state of Texas. The hard left is energized. They're angry. Many of them are